Identifying races with long shots and taking a swing for the big hit. Joe Christopher and Jeremy Plunk talking about a subject that definitely should interest all horse players because we are all looking for the golden goose, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, so to speak, JP, and we can grind it out. We can bet ladder plays, win place and shows on 3-to-1s, 4-to-1s, and send it in when we really like a horse, but you can only go so far with that strategy day in and day out. What makes a profitable year is a big score or two during the course of the calendar season.
Yes, my old boss Tom Quigley used to say, a man can't survive at 3 to 5. You need a little bit of prices in your plays, and I think that when you swing for the fences, there are a couple key elements to look for, and we'll go over all those and perhaps how to construct that ticket as well, so that you can strike when the iron is hot. There are races that set themselves up for potential prices, and we're going to identify some of those.
Yeah, and JP, when you have success doing something and picking a price shot, that angle will tend to stick with you. So I know you've got some of those angles, and so do I, and we'll have a good conversation about them during the course of this video. Let's start with the races. What kind of races yield themselves to big prices, therefore big payoffs? And I think the first thing that we need to mention, which is pretty obvious, is the size of the field. Very rarely are you going to have a big score in a 6-horse race unless you bet every horse to show and a bridge jumper happens to lose. But the bigger the field, the better the opportunity for a high payoff.
Well, there is, and I use this example a lot, but it's really stark. If you're a trifecta player in a 10-horse field, there are 720 different ways your trifecta can come in. In a 7-horse field, there are 210 ways. So taking 3 horses out of a trifecta limits you by more than 500 combinations that are potential losers. Simply put, the math won't work for you. And if you're playing a pick 4, 10 horses in a race, 10 by 10 by 10 by 10, there are 10,000 different combinations. When you reduce that to 7 horses in a race, Joe, 2,401. So really, 7,500 more combinations in a 10-horse field than in a 7-horse field in a pick 4. You have to let the math work in your favor.
Well, what kind of races can we zero in on if we do have big fields in a particular race? What kind of race yields themselves more so to bigger prices than some of the others do?
Well, one thing I've uncorked in my research, looking at my database, more than 2,000 races, deep closers are overlay prices. That's probably because they don't flatter themselves in speed figures. Pace handicappers don't really like them. A horse who's 10 lengths behind, I looked at this study at Keeneland, horses 10 lengths behind at the half-mile pole, the average winning price is 9-1. The average on all winners is about 6-1. So you're looking at almost a 50% more return on deep closers. So you need to identify races that look like the pace could melt down. Pair that with what we're talking about in the large field sizes. Big price, fast pace. Big fields often have a fast pace and can fall apart late.
And JP, when you're talking about deep closers, those kinds of races often play out on the grass. You've got competitive fields. You've got several live 10, 15, 20-to-1 shots, particularly in these mid-level $25,000, upwards of $40,000 claiming races where virtually every horse in the race has a chance on paper. So you add in the grass scenario with the closers and potential big prices, and that's another way that you can identify a race that has a chance to provide huge payoffs, particularly if you don't like the favorite.
Yeah, vulnerable favorites, another very key point to look at. A vulnerable favorite in a big field, because the way the odds work, the more money bet on a heavy vulnerable favorite, the points work out that the other horses that are long shots are exaggerated long shots. And those horses might be 15, 16-1 that really should be 8, 9, 10-1 in their true sense and chance of winning the race. So look for vulnerable favorites again in those situations with the big fields. That's the time you start licking your chops and say, this is the kind of race I want to dive into and try to make a big score on.
Especially, JP, when that vulnerable favorite is a speed horse and there's other speed in the race, because that plays into your scenario where the race falls apart and maybe that favorite at 4-5 doesn't even hit the board, and that's a time where potential bombs can be dropped. Other scenarios where there are long shot potential. I think a drying out racetrack provides a lot more random results on dirt. More on that in just a little bit. I try to stay away from races where I think there'll be random results where I don't have an opinion, but if you're a long shot player, especially those that are just taking shots at long shots from the beginning of a race card, a drying out racetrack can definitely yield those kind of returns.
And if you're a multi-race player, a pick three, a pick four, even a pick five, or a rainbow six kind of player, and you're looking for prices, chances are somewhere in that sequence you're going to run into one of those races that you would normally skip on an intra-race situation. You really don't have an opinion, but it's part of the four, it's part of the five, it's part of the six, and you've got to dive into it. So, like we're saying, these are the times to say, let's spread, let's get as much coverage as we can, and maybe even roll the dice and eliminate the favorite in those situations.
And we always talk about taking advantage of opportunities. Check out carryover pools, especially if there's mandatory payouts on the final day of the meet. Those are pools you want to be involved in. Okay, JP, we've talked about situations and races where you want to get involved and potentially take a swing for the fences. Now we need to figure out how to identify those long shots to include in our tickets. There are people that are called chalk eating weasels. They like to bet the favorite. I was at the South Elgin OTB this past weekend, and a guy kept coming up to me with $100 win bets on 4 to 5 shots. He just wanted to cash. If the favorites win that day, he's going to have a profitable afternoon. But there are also people called whale watchers who bet long shots in almost every situation and scenario. Every race is its own animal. Not every race leads itself to a long shot payout, and I think identifying the correct long shots in the correct races is how you're eventually going to potentially make one of those fine scores.
I think you have to be careful as a handicapper of not falling into that hero complex, where you're just trying to make that heroic pick every race. You're trying to land on the 15, 20, 30 to 1 to be the cutest guy or the cutest gal in the room when your horse finally does win, and you make sure you tell everybody about it. These horses don't win that often. I know you've got some facts and stats on the percentage of long shots that win races, Joe, and to think that you're going to pull those horses off with any kind of regularity, it isn't really being honest to yourself. So finding and identifying when you want to pull the trigger on a price is very important.
Well, just a blanket statement, about 15% of the races are won by horses that 10 to 1 or higher. So not only are only 15% of the races won, which could be maybe 2 or 3 a day depending on how many races are on a particular card, but you have to find those right horses. There are 10, 20, 15 to 1, 30 to 1 shots in every race every day. So finding the correct long shots that win at the right time, that's the battle that we're trying to uncover more information on tonight. JP, some of your favorite angles for picking long shots?
Well, I think you want to identify horses who have a good chance of winning based on the horse's form, but are from low profile connections. That being the jockey, the trainer, and even the owner in some instances. But statistically speaking, we're looking at the stats of the jockeys and trainers so often in our handicapping. In fact, they're overemphasized in modern handicapping today. So if you have a low percentage trainer, a low percentage jockey, but the horse looks good on paper and they fit, I promise you they will be an overlay price. On the flip side, any horse ridden by a top jockey or trained by a top trainer are always going to be an underlay. So when those horses are underlaid and people are just betting the humans, that pushes the price up on horses who have a reasonable chance of winning, but don't come from that more fashionable barn or from that hot riding jockey. And look, most of these guys win between 10 and 20%. That margin isn't that great when you're in it for the short run. You're not betting 1,000 races in a row. So the long term means nothing to you when you talk about jockey and trainer stats to me. It's about the short term. So if you look at a particular horse, you think he's got a decent shot in this race, he might be 14 to 1 because the jockey on him's not in the top 10 and had a leading rider bid on him. That horse may be 4 to 1.
Very, very true. Now, for me, being a visual handicapper, JP, I watch a lot of races, watch a lot of replays, take a lot of notes, and a lot of people see trouble trips, the obvious trouble, the trouble that everyone sees, the trouble that makes it into the footnote. There's other kinds of trouble, hidden trouble, positioning in a race, horses that are compromised by the trip and the pace, and in those kinds of situations you can find price shots going into their next race. Also, I'm not a big believer in weight, but over a distance of ground, over a tiring racetrack, in a cheap race with a bug rider, you can find some bombs away priced winners. Horses that win at 20 to 1, 25 to 1, 30 to 1, just because the track is tiring, just because the track is off, and just because they have that 5, 7, or even 10-pound break in the weight. So those are a couple of the angles. Some other obvious ones: equipment changes, blinkers, Lasix, geldings. Also how horses look in the post braid, which I know you and I are very much interested in during the lead up to the wagering of a race, is how the horses look, particularly in races where we may not have a defined opinion.
And if you're going deep in the exotics, if you're talking trifectas, superfectas, third, fourth, a horse who may not look like anything on paper could look just good enough on the track that you think they're going to beat half the field. That puts them in the mix to run third or fourth and be on the bottom of your tri and superfecta. Joe, I want to add one more angle to look at in this area that we're talking about. And this is one that the old dog learned a new trick on. I've got to admit, I've been handicapping since I was knee-high to the rail. And for years, I used to bitch and moan and complain about class risers. And after doing our horse player now place report over the years with you guys, I've learned one thing. A total disregard for class can be a good thing sometimes. I've seen handicappers on our reports pick horses that I just look at and I scratch my head and say, this horse does not fit on class. But a good horse who's in good form right now, stepping up in class, there are enough curmudgeons like me out there saying they can't possibly do it, that this is an angle and a place where you do get a price, especially in stakes races with inexperienced horses. We've seen maidens step up and win 2-year-old stakes, those 3-year-old prep races on the road to the Triple Crown where that class rise comes up, and it may not be from a fashionable barn. I would say having a disregard for class sometimes can be your best friend in trying to find a bomb.
And a lot of that, JP, goes back to visuals and how the horse won at that lower level and understanding that they won with something in reserve and they may be capable of taking that class hike, particularly, and all goes back to what we said before, if the favorites in the race are vulnerable, you can have that horse step up that doesn't have the class and perhaps break through at a big price. Now, we've identified some ability, at least on paper, to identify some long shots, but if you don't put them in the correct ticket construction, you can pick a long shot and still not win. What are some of your suggestions as to how to go about stepping up to the plate and sending it in?
Well, let's look at just an individual single horse. If you're looking at playing a long shot horse, anytime you have a horse over 6-1 in my mind, I think you need to bet to win in place because a 6-1 shot's going to pay in that $18 area to win, going to pay $8 or $9 to place. That means you can still double your money with a place bet, betting a horse straight up win in place. I don't get much into the show pool. I know you like the ladder horses, but for me, if the horse is 6-1 or more, I think you have to get win in place. You start getting horses up over 10-1, 15-1, 20-1, get the straight money on them, and then build out from your exotics. Don't be afraid to put a horse like that on top as long as you get that straight money first off. If you have a horse 10-1 that you really love, build around them. Win in place bet on that 10-1. Exacta 10 over a couple of those horses. Trifecta, that horse keyed on top with a few, and maybe the all ball can be your best friend in the third spot. Do not be afraid to play all around the long shot horse. Don't just kind of wimp out and say, yeah, I'll be happy if I get a little bit of a return in the win, place, and show pool. Prices are your friends. Go for them.
Yeah, I totally agree. You need to take advantage of the long shot horses that you like because there's no worse feeling in horse racing than liking a horse at 10-1, gimmicking all over the place, watching that horse win and losing money. There's no worse feeling than that. So get into the win and place pools, maybe the show pools if it's a big field, as we mentioned earlier. JP, you mentioned the trifectas. If you like a long shot, maybe key that horse in first, second, and third with some other logical horses around it, because even if that horse finishes second or third with the right chaos in the race, you could still make a big score. Or maybe key 2 horses on top. Your long shot, another square price horse, 2 in the top spot, couple more in second, few more in third, depending on your bankroll, and try to swing from there. I think an interesting note too here, JP, is I like to play trifectas. Superfectas are harder to hit, but in races like the Kentucky Derby, there can be a huge discrepancy between the trifecta payoff and the superfecta payoff. So in the right race, and I don't play a lot of supers, it may make sense to extend your ticket into the top 4 spots.
And again, look for the large field sizes. That's why the Derby is so appealing. I mean, that 20 combination, I mean, you're talking 20 times 19 times 18 times 17. I mean, it's almost an infinite number of combinations that could come in that superfecta. I, myself, not a big super player. I will play them on occasion. I love to play the supers in the quarter horse races. I think the nose finishes and the bobs and things like that, it's very difficult to separate a contender from second, third, and fourth. So when I play my AQHA racing, I play a lot more supers than I do in the thoroughbred ranks. I'm primarily a trifecta player when I'm swinging for the fences and a pick 4 player in the thoroughbred ranks. And I think with that trifecta, do not be afraid to take all in third in a trifecta because it's not that expensive. You got to understand, in a 12-horse field, you have to have a horse who wins. You have to have a horse who runs second. That only leaves 10 horses that can run third. You're not talking about combinations that are going to start costing you $60, $70, $80. You could put together great trifecta tickets They give you a chance to win $1,000 on a $20 ticket every single day. $20 to $30 is the proper price point, I think, in putting together a good trifecta ticket. Now, if you have more money and you're a bigger budget player, then you play that $20 ticket 4, 5, 6 times if you want to get up to an $80, $100, $120 bet on a particular race. But I don't think you need to go into more combinations and say 20 or 30 combinations in a trifecta and still be swinging for the fences. It's just more focused, and you get paid more when you're right.
Well, JP, earlier we talked about identifying races. If you're a multi-race player, I think you also need to identify sequences in the pick four and the pick five that you're comfortable with, especially if there's one race that's absolute chaos and you feel like hitting the all ball. You've got a couple other races where maybe you can single and a couple of other races where you can use a couple of horses, including a long shot or two. You always talk about being defined in your wagering and making a smaller investment for the potential at a big score. If you find those kind of sequences in the pick four or the pick five, that's when it's a good time to take an opportunity at taking a swing for the fences as well.
The pick four, if you want to get a big return, you're looking to beat 2 favorites. I mean, that's pretty much the long and short of it. You've got to beat 2 of the favorites. If you get 3 out of 4 favorites in a pick four, you're not going to get a return, even if you get a bomb in that off leg. So you need to find races where you think the favorites are vulnerable in 2 of the 4 legs in order to play a serious pick four ticket and go for a price. If you think the favorites are vulnerable in 3 or 4 legs of the pick four, those are the days to invest more. I'm not against somebody putting 70, 80, 100 combinations into a pick four ticket if there's a chance of getting that big return. You have to look at the sequence and figure out what it might pay. If you think it's going to be an average pick four and come back at $400, $500 for a buck, I don't see the sense in putting together a $128 ticket and getting 3 to 1 or 4 to 1 and still having to come up with 4 winners. So look at what it could pay, what the potential is, based on the vulnerability of the favorites in the sequence.
Identify races, identify sequences, identify long shots, identify vulnerable favorites, and then put them into a winning formula where you too can swing for the fences and hit a home run. For Jeremy Plunk, I'm Joe Christofak. Enjoy the rest of this episode of Night School.